Talk Like an Egyptian, a podcast about ancient Egypt with Dr. Chris Naunton and Izzy Lawrence.
In this episode, we continue on from last week's look at Egyptology 101. This episode, we focus on religion. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Egyptology 102, because Chris had too much to say in last week's episode, which was all about the subject of Egyptology, which turned out not to be as boring as I thought it might be. I'm Izzy Lawrence, by the way. Hello. Over there, you might notice that is Dr. Chris Naunton. Hello, Chris.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Izzy.
Hello. I like that. That was very sort of arriving at a party. Hi. Well, this is a party.
Well, it's kind of what it's like.
We've got to concentrate on the rest of Egyptology because we missed out a massive chunk. We did a really fun bonus episode, by the way, of the top famous Egyptians. I think for another bonus, maybe after this, we should do the top favourite gods. I think that's the gods that people have heard of. That might be quite a fun one.
Oh, yeah, that's good. Yeah, that is a good idea.
Because the big thing that we didn't talk about in the last episode, when talking about what Egyptology is religion. What
we
missed
talk about
out, which is kind of like the pyramids, the gods, the everything that everybody knows about. So let's me do this to you. Okay, this is the best question. Welcome to your UCAS form where you have to write an essay in order to get in to one of the Oxbridges. If you want to become a Bembridge scholar, right, what do we mean by religion, Chris?
Oh, golly, gosh.
Yeah, exactly. It's horrible, isn't it?
I was certainly not encouraged to apply for Oxbridge. Not clever enough.
What about the Bembridge scholars, though? You got in there?
Yes, I suppose I did, didn't I?
You did.
Just not allowed to admit that they exist. Okay, what is religion? So what we mean by that in terms of the Egyptians, well, it's an absolutely enormous topic. We can only imagine how long I'm going to go rambling on for here. What we mean by this is the Egyptians' belief in supernatural beings, gods and goddesses, and in how the world around them, around the ancient Egyptians, was brought into being and influenced by these powerful gods and goddesses, and in how humankind could interact with those gods and goddesses in order to, they would hope, ensure that things could continue to go the way they would want, but also the ways in which occasionally humankind in its interactions with the gods doesn't do the right thing, and that brings about terrible things. So I suppose the really important things are how the world came into being, how the world is maintained, and what happens to you after your life. They had concepts of all of these things, and gods and goddesses to sort of play the part of beings in control of this stuff.
It's basically how you got here and where you're going to.
That's a nice, succinct way of putting it. Yeah.
It was all fine.
You're not wrong.
Until like the late 18th century, when everybody got into science and rationality, and then they demanded you separate it out, and then it became tricky for everybody, because now religion is a thing. So thank you, Enlightenment. Before then, it was all jumbled together and lovely, and only people like Galileo had to get locked away. So that's religion. But okay, can we talk about the origins of the universe? Are you prepared to do that? Because my favourite one is Ptah's version. Because to me, Ptah's version sounds very much like that bit in Genesis, which is in the beginning there was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Because the whole thing of Ptah is he comes out of the primordial, the Nun type situation, the primordial waters, and he speaks his own name. And when he speaks his own name, he creates everything. Like he creates land and himself. Yes. Which makes a lot more sense than instead of saying God's name, which I won't do in case we've got any Jewish listeners, listening, but instead of him saying his name, Ptah is a much more logical start to the universe, because it's Ptah. It's much more of a Big Bang sort of beginning than, this sort of like, several syllable name of the Christian God. So it's not the good start, but Ptah is exactly what you want. But that's my favourite one of the origin stories, because there's more than one, isn't there?
Yeah, there are, but that one or variations of it are the best known and most well developed. So actually, before we go any further, we probably ought to say that although it would be very convenient if there was a kind of set text for Egyptian mythology and and a sort of set cast of characters, a set series of
Stop
stories.
saying Set, because now I'm thinking of the god Set, and that's confusing everything.
Yes, no such thing ever existed. And again, back to Egyptology 101 in the previous episode, where we were talking about the immense span of time that ancient Egypt was in existence for, 3,500 years. On the one hand, as we were saying then, lots of stability. On the other hand, lots of evolution and change within that. So if you imagine that the religion as we know it, and if you buy a book or you watch a TV show or whatever, or you listen to a podcast about religion, their temptation is to say, this is what they believed. And, this is the story and these were the gods. And actually, it was a whole much, much larger melting pot of different stories with different versions of them. And those probably varied from region to region. So despite the fact that Egypt comes into being and what Egypt is a unity of people in a particular place. And as we were saying in the last episode, that's people brought together under a common language and beliefs and that sort of thing. There's still regional variation. So all of this means that, when we're trying to reconstruct Egyptian religion using archaeological and textual sources, we're gathering scraps and pieces of bits and pieces from different places and different times, all of which we can sort of jam together into a coherent mass. But actually, there is no one right story. So you're quite right. There are lots of versions of the creation story, but the one that's the best known, the one that you've already described, is this one in which a creator god, the only being in existence at this point, emerges from watery nothingness, and that watery nothingness actually is also personified from time to time as a god or goddess called Nun, Nun. Looks like none, but we say Nun. Often in this story, out of the watery nothingness, an island emerges. And clearly here the Egyptians are observing the natural landscape around them. This is where this idea comes from.
That does remind you of the delta in just general, that the islands do appear in that delta because it changes to do with, lots of lovely erosion, river erosion and deposition and that sort of thing. However, there's also a lot of, myths throughout cultures around the world about before, there was earth, there was water, and there was chaos. It's just a general thing. I've got a feeling it's got to do with the Ice Age and the glaciers melting. And,
Maybe.
The flood myths as well have got to do with the sort of thing of suddenly they retreat and then you have the land and this is the start of everything. This is how
Yes.
we have to start over. So this is how it must have started. There's
Yes,
a sort of
exactly.
logic to it all.
Yes, I suppose if you think about that, the sort of last ice age and the receding glaciers and receding, what would you call them? Areas that are uninhabitable for human beings. You can't live in the ocean.
No,
things do live in the ocean, but
alas.
human beings can't live in the ocean. So oceans provide natural kind of boundaries at the edge of the land, beyond which it is all chaos. Meanwhile, the land itself is what human beings live off. It's what animals wander about on, and crops grow on, and plants grow on, and so life springs forth. And I suppose you're quite right. If you imagine the end of the ice age, people might, over time, or perhaps at the end of winter, beginning of spring, they would have observed maybe the ice receding, and then eventually things starting to grow. And in an Egyptian landscape, you're quite right that in the delta and also in the Nile Valley, they would have observed the water of the river, which, important though it was not somewhere people could live. Whereas islands springing forth from it, and islands do naturally form in the Nile and in the delta, things then grow on those. So there's this idea that there's a being that appears on an island. Artum. This is going to be very difficult for me as a modest Englishman, confused and discombobulated by such things. But being on his own and wanting to procreate, our God has to find a way
Yes.
of
Yes.
of
But don't get into
bringing
too
about
much
new
detail.
life on his own,
Indeed.
boys and girls. And so
Indeed.
he commits an act of onanism.
Which I think, and kids, if you're listening, don't look into it. It's fine. He basically works out a way of creating life by himself.
He does, yes.
Yes.
And there are some marvelous, very large statues of a creator god with the crucial piece of the anatomy missing, but with the hand in exactly the right place.
Excellent. Well, it's also where you'd scatter seeds from anyway, because you scatter, like if you're breadcrumbing, like ducks and stuff, that's just
Yes.
naturally how you scatter. So maybe it's just scattering seeds. Who knows?
Yes, exactly. It's only, exactly.
Yeah.
No, this is entirely natural, all of this.
I mean, what we consider inappropriate and what they did is very different because obviously, and there will be episodes of this podcast where we will have to talk about, all sorts of weird marriages and goings on.
Oh, yes, that's also true. Yes, don't try that at home, kids.
So, so from an academic point of view, he committed onanism in order to create life, and where he creates life, he gets children, doesn't he? He gets like sets of twins, or he gets, I can't remember. They're brothers and sisters. Together.
Two children are born from this initial act of onanism, of sort of self creation or whatever you'd call it. So Artum, and we're calling him Artum, Atum, in this
Not
retelling of the
Arton,
story.
different dude.
Not the Arton of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, no, Artum, Atum.
Because Tar looks like a dude and is green because he's kind of corpsey, I think. What does Artoon look like? Has he got a...
No very distinctive appearance, actually, and you don't very, very often see him depicted in iconography. I mean, you do, but not as commonly as some other gods. He's generally just shown in human form. Yes, we'll maybe come on to the way that gods appear. And again, I want to emphasize that sort of point that there isn't a standard way of depicting really any of the gods. They can appear in various different ways. They can commonly have such and such an appearance, but it isn't possible to go to a temple wall or a tomb wall and go, oh, this god looks like that, therefore it must be such and such.
Come on! If somebody's holding a tablet, right, with his little quill like that, and he's got an ibis head, that's Thoth. Come on.
It most likely is, but if you were to find an example with a little hieroglyphic label next to it and it names a different god, don't be that surprised. It happens quite a lot. That's the only way of being absolutely sure if there's a little label, a little name that you can read. Okay. So Artum, typically shown in human form, he gives birth to air and moisture. Tefnut is air and Shu is moisture. I think it's that way around.
I think that's right.
And they are male and female. So Tefnut is female, Shu is male. So they can then, and here's where you were talking about inappropriate relationships. Although they are brother and sister, having been born to the same father, they form a union and procreate and have two children of their own. Geb, male, god of the earth, the embodiment of the earth, and Nut, female, the embodiment of the sky. So in this way, as you can see, the world is coming about. First of all, there's watery nothing. Then we've got Artum on his island. Then we've got air and moisture. Then we have the earth and the sky. And the earth and the sky, again, brother and sister, get together and they procreate and they have 4 children. And at this point, they are gods, but kind of human form gods. 4 of them. Osiris, male, who partners up with his sister Isis, female.
No. Set was first with Isis. Get that right. Set and Isis had partnered up, and then Osiris nicked Set's wife. That's why Set gets all upset. I don't know if we get the word upset from that, but we should do.
In which version of the myth are you?
I think it's that. I might be completely misremembering, but I remember, right, that Osiris and so Set and Isis are together, and then she basically leaves Set for Osiris, and that's what motivates Set and gets him all angry.
There may be a version in which that's the case. I'm not aware of it.
Okay, cool. Well, I've
Yeah,
got
there
completely
might
wrong
be, there
end
might
of
well be a version, and we should bear in mind that there are lots of different versions of these stories. I'm not aware of that one.
Okay. Votes
And
now. Right underneath if you agree with Izzy's version of the soap opera that is the Osiris story, or maybe I'm being far too forgiving for Set then, because I always assumed that Set was rightfully like annoyed with his brother for nicking his wife.
the earliest retellings of the story that I'm aware of actually only give us tiny little fragments of the story anyway. Even in the later versions, yeah, well, in the so-called contendings of Horus and Seth, and we're skipping ahead here. There are
Yeah, we
lots and
are.
lots of episodes to that.
Well, go back
which
to the
are
beginning. Go back to the beginning. So,
not
we've got Osiris
okay.
and Isis who
Yeah,
definitely go out.
so
They definitely do.
yeah, and in the important parts of the story, I think in the most important parts of the story, we have to think of Osiris and Isis as being a double act, married to all intents and purposes, and then the other brother and sister, Set, being partnered with Nephthys. So four of them altogether, two brothers, two sisters, and Osiris becomes the sort of first king, kind of mythical first king of the world, and according to some texts, was thought to be the inventor of agriculture and winemaking and that kind of thing. So, in other words, the Egyptians at a certain point are starting to credit him with inventing their world. So the natural world has come about through the act of creation. But now, in terms of establishing human society, if you like, Osiris is the man, agriculture and viticulture, and he's a great leader of men.
And Set doesn't really, as far as I can work out, he's like war, isn't he? He's sort of chaotic, like weirdness, and he doesn't even have a proper head. He's always drawn weird as some sort of, and nobody's really sure what he's meant to be. Because you think,
Yes.
oh, he'd be like Anubis, but he's not. He's kind of like this weird, like creature that doesn't actually exist.
Let me try and do a 1-minute summary of the key points of the story. So Osiris is king. Isis is his consort, his wife. Set is very jealous of Osiris and doesn't like the fact that he's the king, and so murders Osiris. And there are various stories to what happens in there. And sends his body off. And Isis retrieves the body, and although he's been murdered, Osiris has been chopped up, essentially. Isis manages to, in one version of the story, collect up all the bits. And it doesn't really matter. The point is, she brings him back to life, and they are able to make love again for a sort of final time. So he's revivified. There's a moment where they copulate, and then they give birth to a son, Horus. And then eventually, and this is where there is a very sort of complicated and
Turns into the Lion
long and
King.
involved. Is that what happens? I don't know about the Lion King.
Well, okay, Hamlet. It's basically,
I also
not
don't know
Hamlet's
about
more.
that.
Okay,
I know
so
that.
so
About any of
basically,
these things.
Lion King is an evil uncle and has to fight.
Yeah.
So the uncle
Yeah. Okay.
kills the king, and
Yeah.
then the son, who goes on a bit of goes off in the thing, has to come back and fight his evil uncle and vanquishes him. Because while
Yep.
Osiris, I think he becomes king of the underworld, and then Set becomes the first king of becomes a king of Egypt, and then Horus has to fight him or something. I can't remember. And he loses an eye, hence the Eye of Horus, but does he? And sometimes they turn into animals, and sometimes they don't, and it depends which blooming myth you read.
Yeah, exactly. So there are endless kind of episodes in the story of the battle, particularly between Horus and Seth. But essentially, you can imagine what happens is Seth becomes the king, murders Osiris, becomes the king. Horus grows up, avenges his father's death by reclaiming the throne and becoming the king. The really important thing here for Egypt and the Egyptians, from the point at which that myth becomes established, we don't exactly know when that was, but possibly not until the Old Kingdom at the earliest. So a few centuries after Egypt has become created. We're not really sure. But by the time it's established, for the Egyptians, every king is a manifestation of Horus, and the son who avenges his father's death. So every time a king comes to the throne, he becomes a Horus. one of the king's names. They have this very long titulary. Is the Horus name, which is written inside an enclosure with an image of the god Horus in the form of a falcon. Horus typically shown as a human being with a falcon head, or as a falcon, not always, but that's normal. And at the moment of death, the king becomes an Osiris, comes at one with Osiris. So the idea is that after he and Isis had slept together and she had conceived Horus, Osiris then sort of dies again, and then goes off to become the lord of the underworld, dwells in the underworld forever as the kind of, the head of all dead people.
And he's the guy that will be your ultimate judge in the Hall of Two Truths, where your heart gets weighed against the feather.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly.
He's pictured there with Isis behind him.
Exactly. So he's the guy down there in charge of the place where everybody goes to in the afterlife. So in other words, this myth, the story of Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Seth, has a great big bearing on the way the Egyptians conceive of their king. They think of them, they think of all the kings as actually being Horus, and then becoming Osiris in death. It also has an important bearing on the way the Egyptians conceive of what happens in the next life, because they all think they're going to this place where Osiris is in charge. He's like the sort of the realm of the dead where Osiris is. So they all think they're going to meet Osiris in the next life. So it's that story, underpins two of those really important aspects of for the ancient Egyptians: the myth of kingship and the myth of what happens in the next life.
We've talked a little in the previous series about the balance of the yin and the yang of, how
Yes.
Ancient Egypt. But it is weird to me that, like, Ramses I looked at his little son and said, "I know what I'm going to call you, who'll one day rule Egypt. Seti." Like, as in, not like a couch, but like after Set, the guy who murdered, Osiris, who you're going to meet when you're older, and also who you kill as Horus. That's who I'm going to name you after, little baby. It's weird to me.
Yes, it does seem weird, doesn't it? Because the temptation is for us to see this as, and it is essentially this, a story of sort of good versus evil, if you like. Just in terms of the sort of idea of there being a very well-established good guy and a very well, nobody's in any doubt, as the viewer, when you're watching Star Wars or you're watching Gunsmoke or
The Lion King. You need to watch The Lion King.
I do, obviously, yeah.
Because you have to imagine Set is, voiced by Jeremy Irons, and therefore deeply brilliant.
Oh, is he? Yeah. Oh, I like Jeremy
it's
Irons.
good. Yeah, exactly. Scar. It's good. Anyway, carry on.
So so that idea of very well established kind of good versus evil, the story looks like that. But the Egyptians things are slightly different in that for the Egyptians there needs to be this kind of duality. That's the right word. So when they observe the world around them, they see the fertile land of the Nile Valley and the Delta, and then they see the barren land of the desert, and they see the one bank of the river and then the other side. They see the sun rising and the sun setting, and they were you could see in their architecture, they were very keen on symmetry and duality, and importantly, balance. So Set, who is the bad guy who murders Osiris and takes the throne, comes to represent concepts like you mentioned: war, chaos, storms, the desert, as opposed to the very fertile agricultural land of the Nile Valley. But for the Egyptians, you need to have that,
because without the desert, you get invaded. Without storms, you don't see. Storms aren't as important in ancient Egypt as they are in other cultures. I think that you get gods like Baal, and you get sort of very prominent storm gods who not only bring chaos but also bring very much needed wetness and rain for the crops and that sort of thing. But that's probably not such a big deal in ancient Egypt because they got the inundation. But storms are like my favourite, and I've got to say his name, and he's going to rain on me. Right, but it's a Sumerian god called Ningersu, and he's very powerful because when you mention him, apologies if you're going to get wet. But he's a brilliant one. He's basically a massive lion head that roars with wings, and he rains on you. And I spoke to an archaeologist called Sebastian who was digging in Gersu And when he found his
Oh.
temple, a massive thunderstorm happened. So it was literally
very
on the
poetic.
threshold of this building, and only after the storm had cleared, they worked out whose it was, and then went, "Oh yeah, you did tell us." But storms just come in like that so quickly that it makes sense, his description and everything else. But yes, storms less important, I think, for the people of Egypt as to other peoples in the Mesopotamian region.
Yeah, and in fact, I was more thinking actually that there is a time in the 18th and also 19th dynasty when a certain number of what you might call Asiatic gods come to be important in the northeastern delta. So in the area of Egypt that's the closest to where those gods would normally have been worshipped, and they tended to conflate a god like Baal with Set. Anyway, so yeah, it may well be that you're right that storm's not so important, but that there's that aspect of Seth, particularly in combination with Baal. But anyway, the important thing is that they need that balance. That's what you were getting at, and you were dead right. And so at a time in the early 19th dynasty, when you've got a family on the throne who are from the northeastern delta, who may well have been particularly interested in, if not specifically Seth, then gods like him who had similar qualities, it was perfectly legitimate to worship the bad guy, and and because Set was important, that comes to be a name given to children of the time, and one of those kids eventually goes on to become, well, two of them actually, to become kings, Seti the First and Seti the Second. Yes, Seti, a version of the same name, Set.
Help me with that, because I know that the word Moses, so you get Thutmoses and you get Ra Moses, and Moses means to be born. Is there an E meaning to that, or is it just a way of saying it? I don't.
Not that I'm aware of, actually. No,
Okay, cool.
I'm not entirely sure why it's spelt with that E ending. I'm not aware of that having any meaning. No.
That's fair. Every time that anybody says it, though, it does make me think of something to sit on, which is unfortunate.
Yes, and that reminds me of that Richard Herring program.
Oh yeah,
on
Lord of the
Sunday
Dance
mornings
City.
with the Lord of the Dance Settee. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which
it's good.
if you weren't there, maybe
Exactly.
not funny, but I thought it was hilarious at the
Yeah.
time.
We've sort of established, therefore, the creation story, which is various methods of the world appearing out of the chaos that is the Nun, stability being looked at by the children of the original gods, who basically fight each other. One goes down, Osiris becomes king of the underworld. Isis just chills, I think. She sort of hangs around with him still in the underworld, but I think she still gets worshipped as well. Horus becomes pharaoh, and all pharaohs that follow him represented by it, and Seti's just a bit chaotic but sweet. So what I want to push on, though, which is this idea which is very different to our own idea of religion, is it's not it's very geographic. So in the same way that we for example, in the Christian religion, different churches are named after different saints and local saints and things like that, and you can go to specific places to worship different saints. It's very, very regionalised, the way that certain cities in ancient Egypt really sort of like champion one particular deity.
Yes, that's right.
It is the normal thing in terms of how religion has been. I mean, it is the normal thing that you have one god in charge of a specific area who looks after the people in that area, and they worship that god, and that god is often represented actually as a physical thing. So you have a not just a representation, but something carved that is actually them, that can be kidnapped by other people and all the rest of it, and you have to give offerings to that specific thing. That's how it's not this sort of like all-encompassing, they're everywhere, and
they are and they aren't. On the one hand, again, back to what I was saying at the start, the temptation is for us to see all Egyptians as having an identical set of beliefs and practices. And we should say this, it's not just beliefs, but there's also, practices as well, which we know something about, but not very much about. But there would have been this regional variation. If you think that there are thousands of gods in ancient Egypt, which is true, I'm fond of explaining this by saying to people that a few years ago, probably about 20 years ago now, a colleague of mine called Christian Lights and a team published a dictionary of Egyptian gods and goddesses, which is literally just a dictionary. They're not long sort of narrative text explaining about the gods and goddesses. They are just the name and then bibliographic references. and that of every known god, or every god attested in any text or whatever, it's 8 volumes long. That
Wow.
dictionary. So it's thousands and thousands of gods. Many, most of whom are only ever attested once. So we know nothing about them. So there might be an image on a wall, and all we know is that that's them and their name's that, and we don't know anything else. And what that hints at is that there's a whole massive amount of belief out there that we've got no knowledge of at all. So at the other end of the spectrum, there's a few extremely well-known and well-established and probably universal stories. So Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Seth, that probably was universal. I think we can assume that. But there would still have been this regional variation, and so even for the gods who are the best known and sort of at the top, if you like, the ones that were perhaps approaching universal, each of them has usually a particular place in the country which is their center of worship. So Osiris cult center is at the site of Abydos, which is in Upper Egypt. Isis cult center is at Philae, strangely enough, hundreds of kilometers away.
Thoth is in Memphis.
Well, their altar is to some extent in Memphis. Hermopolis is the major center of Thoth, because the city's Greek name gets its Greek name because the Greeks associated Thoth with their god Hermes, hence Hermopolis, the city of Hermes. Yeah, and so you're quite right that from one part of the country to another, you might find yourself in the cult center of such and such a god. This probably derives from the fact that originally, maybe even before the unification of Egypt, different groups of people in different parts of the Nile Valley had different ideas, and they're all eventually, at the time of the unification, just kind of whacked together, and all collected together as if they were all sort of the same. And some of those stories will undoubtedly have come to be sort of merged and conflated, which is why you get overlapping but varying versions of the creation story, or the story of Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Seth as well. It might be sort of borrowing slightly different stories from different places, but then changing the names. So it might well be that actually, say, there's a version of the story where the reason the jealous brother murders the king is because the king is together with a different wife or whatever. But then that comes to be sort of those names get changed. It becomes a part of the Osiris story. So depending on which god you might be interested in, or you might have to go to a different part of the country to find their temple. But all temples, to some extent, are temples to sort of all the gods.
Okay.
There's a kind of standardization in architecture and decoration and in ritual, as far as we can tell. But then there are these little sort of peculiarities that relate to particular gods and goddesses and particular stories relating to them as well.
But there's also, like, later on, when you mentioned rituals, so there are certain things that you do at certain temples, and there's certain temples that you feel are almost like, the equivalent of a Muslim's Mecca, that you sort of have to visit before you die. It's seen as a great pilgrimage that you go on, like the Hajj. When the animal cults really sort of get going, there's sort of very particular things that you have to bring with you at these temples. And like I'm thinking of as you say in Hermopolis, about the you have to have a little mummified ibis to give to Thoth and put in order to get your prayers answered and that sort of thing. So there are, it does change, because obviously that wasn't there 1,000 years before. But
you've set this up very nicely, because I think this is a really good Egyptology 101 kind of thing, actually, which I didn't have on my original list. But I think people tend to think, don't they, the Egyptians, they loved animals. They loved cats, didn't they, the Egyptians? Oh yeah, they love cats.
No.
And actually, and actually, there is a period of Egyptian history right at sort of the very end where animal cults become a really big deal, but it's at the very end. And so in the time of, say, Tutankhamun, animal cults are not anything like as well developed as they would be. Having said that, because the Egyptians, because so much of their religious beliefs and their myths are clearly inspired by what they observed in the natural world, they combined, or they saw certain animals, for example, as being the embodiment of certain gods. So animals they found particularly striking, like the lion, for example, very strong, or the bull, very strong, or snake, very dangerous.
Crocodile.
These having particular qualities, which might be the sorts of qualities you might imagine a god having, or the king having. So the king is often in one way or another compared to a bull, or a falcon. Also is another god that particularly attracted the Egyptians' attention, and they saw qualities in the falcon that they wanted to superimpose onto their gods.
Jackal and Anubis.
Jackal and Anubis, right? Exactly. You can well imagine that the Egyptians observed jackals at the fringes of civilization in the desert, and perhaps in the desert to the west, where they also observed the sun setting. So they think to themselves, well, hang on, sun setting. The sun we know, of course, is the god Ra, and we know that it makes a journey through the sky every day, and we know that at the end of his journey, every day, Ra descends down into the earth to carry on his journey into the underworld. And we see those jackals there all the time. So, in the same way as Ra descending down into the ground, we associate with the moment of the death of the individual, because there are all those jackals hanging around there. They must be to do with that as well. So if we need a god of mummification, which we do, then it probably better be a sort of jackal god, maybe, because clearly they're hanging around at the place where people are dying in the west, where the sun is setting.
I love the way that you've romanticized that. So it's all through the sunset and these animals, and that they're hanging around the mummification tents because they can smell dead meat.
Oh,
That's
well,
fun.
also, yes, might also be that, yeah. And so, of course, the Egyptians also, if we know one thing about sort of Egyptian iconography or art, it's people with animal heads. And of course, what's going on there is that the Egyptians are imagining their gods having these qualities we talk about, that are qualities they observe in certain animals. So, so Horus comes to be associated with a falcon of some kind. So therefore, the god Horus is depicted often in the form of a human being with a falcon head. The king often, even if he's completely in human form, often has a bull's tail growing out of the appropriate spot in his lower back, to as a way of sort of showing that the king has some of the qualities of a bull, strength or whatever. So animals are very important. Having said all this, like I say, I do think it's important to remember that you don't always see Horus depicted in that way. Isis is often depicted with some sort of bird headdress associated with a bird, but not always. Hathor often is associated with the cow, but also with the same sort of bird that Isis is associated with, which means that they look almost indistinguishable from one another, Isis and Hathor.
I think there's a way that we can sort of break down religion a bit more, because there's a certain, if you look in various societies, a certain sort of cross-reference. So there's, first off, you've got the idea of shamanism. So the idea that you can convene with the spirits around you. You've got, we have the idea of a healer. They have magicians that we refer to them as magicians, usually in the texts in ancient Egypt. So they're there. So this idea that you can manipulate the world around you spiritually using spells that the ancient Egyptians, which are a bit like prayers, the fact that they gave offerings and things like that. There's certain rituals that everybody can go through. You've also got this idea in a lot of places around the world of ancestor worship, which I would argue is what happens with Pharaoh. So even after pharaohs have died, you have this idea of ancestor worship, and you also have there's evidence for it in letters, where people feel that they're being cursed by their ancestors. There's all these letters of, somebody saying, I gave you all of, all this, why are you, ruining my life? Why can't you? So there is a sort of idea that you can communicate with the ancestors. And then there's this idea of organized state religion, which is much more and it's sort of like almost state sanctions, and there are very particular rules which could get you in trouble for blasphemy. So there's these sort of three different levels, and ancient Egypt, sort of, you can see them all as a sort of way of understanding how they all sort of slot in with each other, and it's really difficult to pick apart.
I suppose, we have to bear in mind that with just about everything we know about ancient Egypt, the majority of our evidence relates to elites of one kind or another. So much of what we know about temples or temple ritual, what went on in temples, relates to these big state commissioned monuments, which are, at least in part, usually also a way of confirming and articulating the king's role. So they were a bit, they're sort of propaganda for the king as much as they are anything else, or at least there's that element to it. What I'm trying to say is that they don't necessarily tell us very much, if anything at all, about what ordinary people believed and were doing in their day-to-day lives. And you're quite right, that from what little evidence we have, we can tell that beliefs and practices among the ordinary people, like in their houses, villages, towns, whatever, might well have been quite different from those great big state level temples.
But that's true in all religion as well. This is not unique to ancient Egypt.
Although I think you could argue that, Chris, the basic stories of of the Bible, say, are celebrated every bit as much in the village chapel as they are in the cathedral in the capital city. It's not a different set of beliefs.
No, it's not different, but there's a different sets of rituals and practices. So one of my favourites is, like, if you go over to like mining towns, like in the west of Wales in the UK, there was this practice for ages. When they were mining, so mining for coal and things like that, so sort of early 19th century, late 18th century, when they were digging, a lot of mines collapsed and people were buried in them. And they, a big thing in Christianity is you have to repent your sins before you die. You've got to go to confession as you die. And so they had this thing where there were sin eaters who would literally, when they got up, they managed to bring the corpse up, they would put bread and food on the corpse, and a guy would come over and eat the bread off the corpse in order to absorb the sin and then confess afterwards to get the, so all of these little things which you'd never know about if it weren't for people writing them down. You look absolutely flummoxed at that.
No, I was just thinking that's a very good illustration of exactly the point about the Egyptians. Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
So there are ways that these are interpreted under particular circumstances. So that you've got the basic belief there, but then what people are doing is ultimately very particular to them, their families, their situation.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, it's really hard to pick everything out and work out what's actually.
We only have rags and tatters. That's always the thing to keep in mind, is that rags and tatters is a phrase of Sir Alan Gardner's that he used in his History of Egypt.
I mean, basically, if you're an archaeologist, you're spending your life going through other people's bins, which is ironically what Thoth and Ibises do.
Potentially some part of it, yeah.
Well, a lot of it. I mean, that's what we've got, because we talked about Deir el-Medina, that village, and a lot of what we've got from that is their waste paper baskets, which isn't obviously paper, it's bits of pottery that they were practicing writing letters on before wasting good papyrus.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
So
true.
it is, and a lot of, like, particularly, I speak to Iron Age archaeologists quite a lot in this country, and it's just like, it's all slag. That's what they go on about, is this type of, they have to pick through everybody's stuff.
Yeah, well, what people throw away is amazingly informative, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
What you can find on the edge of the Thames. You've got all of these mudlarking.
Exactly, yes.
That's what they call it.
Yeah.
Indeed. That's all you are, Chris, is a professional mudlarker, just so you know.
Well, I don't go grubbing around myself very much anymore. I have been part of archaeological teams, yes.
Yeah.
Not actually in my case working in rubbish dumps particularly, but anyway, but it does happen. You're right. Yeah.
I mean, grave sites technically stuff people are throwing away, but just very nicely in terms of age.
Yes.
There's stuff you want rid of. You don't want to have them hanging, unless you're like, I think the Maya buried their people in their own houses, which is just like, oh.
Yes, yeah, the Egyptians did not do, or almost no cultures do that.
No, I think there's one lovely theory about why the Maya civilization. There's a big sort of dramatic end where they all abandoned their cities in like 900 AD, and they CE. Shut up, Izzy. Right, they all abandoned their cities, and everybody's going, "Oh, it's climate change, it's all this and all that," but nothing quite happens. And my favourite theory is that they literally ran out of space because all the houses were monuments to the dead, and so you could bury dad and grandfather in the same house, but you can then live in it because it's their house. So you have to build your own house, and eventually there's just no space for people, and so they just went, nah, forget it. We're moving out, which I like as an idea, but it's probably a bit more complicated than that, as is religion. So is there anything that we need to add on to this? Because I think, because last week's episode where we went through the top Egyptians, I think we're going to need to go through the top gods as a
The
bonus
gods,
episode
yeah, I
this
think you're
week.
probably right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, the other thing that we haven't covered in this episode, but which we have covered before, is the idea of the passage of the sun through the sky and through the earth at night being part of the Egyptians' belief in what happens in the next life. But we did that, I think, in the afterlife episode, right?
We did do that in the afterlife
Yeah.
episode, so go and listen to that. But there's not just one way. I mean, obviously by boat,
Yes.
because come on, you're going to want to go by boat. And it depends on what period you're in and where you are as to which god is with you at which point, I believe. Because
there are lots of different. Yes, lots of different.
sometimes it's a scarab beetle that's pushing you that way, which is weird.
Yes, exactly. Yes,
Because that's not very dignified. There's no boat. It's just so it's a scarab beetle, and it implies the sun is made out of dung, which I don't think is very respectful.
Doesn't sit nicely with us, does it? Somehow, no.
No, I think Ra might get annoyed with that. But it is that. I mean, to sort of say Ra, the fact is you have him personified with the sun as a sort of hat that he's got on. So Ra has got his sun on. Hip 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 hooray! It's a sort of weird personification, and the sun is also Aten as well later. Oh, it's so complicated.
Yes,
It's complicated.
yes. Well, we also didn't really talk. Actually, yeah. Can I just say, I know we're sort of wrapping up, aren't we? But not only do we have different sort of strands of belief, and we sort of said there's no standard text, there's no standard telling of the particular story. Things could sort of merge and change as well. So something I never like to see in books or anything else is where people will say such and such a god was the god of this, and it was way more fluid than that. You know, I would much prefer. It's a bit more vague, maybe, but for that to be changed to such and such was a god or goddess who was often associated with qualities such as, you know, and then a few, that will give you a sort of general idea. But from one temple wall to the next, or one, bit of evidence to the next, individual gods and goddesses can be associated with actually quite a wide variety of sometimes contrasting things. And they could also come to be merged with one another. So, you might find that in a certain version of such and such a story, it's such and such a god who's the main character. And then in a different retelling, it's a different god. And you think, well, hang on, what is their story? But it just varied enormously. And then you also get this phenomenon that at times you can get sort of two gods merging with one another. So this is what you were just making me think of, because actually in the New Kingdom, the period of the Valley of the Kings, and the period of this, when this idea of the passage of the sun through the sky and through the earth at night becomes developed as the myth, at least for kings, of what happens to you in the next life. This is a time when actually the Egyptians' main god is Amun, but Amun is kind of a god that's difficult to pin down, has kind of creator qualities, but he also comes to be merged with Ra, and in fact, lots of different gods can become merged with Ra. So Horus does also. Atum, the creator god, also sort of merges with Ra. And actually, there's this phenomenon which some people want to see in the New Kingdom, as the Egyptians heading almost towards a kind of monotheism, where all qualities that in different places and at different times are the stories of different gods, all kind of merging into one. As if there is actually only one god, so you get this complicated situation that you have gods that are sometimes compilations of sort of not just more than one, but more than two. Ptah, Sokar, Osiris, Ra, Herakti, or Osiris, Apis, Zeus, this kind of thing. And in that way, Egyptian religion is very fluid and ever evolving, and that makes it much harder for us to sort of pin it down and get our minds around it.
Were there ever sort of battles that we know of, like one temple having a go at another temple, saying we're the best one? I mean, presumably there must have been people championing their temple and therefore their god for the money, for the resources to build more or to get better stuff. But I suppose that counts as just regional politics rather than working for the pharaoh's favour. I don't know if there's any evidence of this. It's just what I'm assuming.
Not that I can't think of specific evidence for that, unless you count the times when the country was divided between rival kings. Let's say there was a time when the country was divided between rival north and south lines, or maybe not rival lines, but lines. The northern kings were all said at that time to be the sons of Bastet, cat goddess, whereas the kings in the south were all said to be the sons of Isis. So it wasn't exactly as though those, Temple of Bastet and Temple of Isis are sort of competing with one another. And we're not even really sure to what extent the kings might have been competing, but they did, because of that regional variation that you first mentioned. If they were rivals at all, then they would have brought into play their gods, in that sense.
When you're a Bastet all the way, from your first cigarette to your last dying day. This is me doing my musical.
Very good.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you. I couldn't think of...
that could be the end credit music for this episode.
I think so. I think, yeah, exactly. We can't afford that. If we get more patrons, maybe we can afford a better music license.
If you sing it, do we still have to pay if you sing it?
I don't think so, no, because one, it wasn't long enough, and two, fortunately, it sounded nothing like the original, which I won't even mention, so we won't get in trouble. You might get demonetized on YouTube. Okay. That's the only thing.
I see. Yeah,
but,
okay.
yeah, but I doubt it. Just from my beautiful rendition there.
No, okay.
Thank you. That good. Anyway, so if you want to help us with our music license and everything else, please do join our Patreon. We will obviously you get bonus episodes. We're about to record one, which will be top 10 gods. So we're going to list out our favourites in the bonus episodes. If you've got a favourite and you want to tell us, please do get in touch via our Patreon or comment below. Whichever you're doing this on, please do like and do subscribe and all of that. But until next time, we're going to leave you with a little spell of our own. Well, it's not of our own. It's of ancient Egypt. Yeah, it is the Vulcan salute, because ancient Egyptians were from... I was going to say Romulus, but there we go. Okay, after three.
After three.
After three. 3, 2, 1.
Life.
Prosperity.
Health.
That was beautiful. So good. It was so cool. Thanks for listening to Talk Like an Egyptian. To support the podcast and ensure another series, join us on patreon.com/Talk Like an Egyptian and unlock bonus content. Get in touch, talklikeanegyptianpod@gmail.com, or use the hashtag TLAE. We need your questions for the end of the series, so please don't hold back. Remember to leave us 5 stars of newts and share this episode with your friends. Find all links at talklikeanegyptian.com.